All along, I've been talking about how important it is to create good selections inside Photoshop, because a good selection really is the basis for pulling off some cool stuff inside your images, whether it's a correction technique of some sort or a special effect or who the heck knows. Well, you saw a whole section on creating selections. We made that rusted sort of robot face. And then not too long ago, you saw the quick selection tool when we were talking about layers. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about something called Photoshop's quick mask mode, which we'll get to shortly. But we're going to start off this discussion on masking with yet another selection technique. This guy is called color range. And I think of this guy as sort of like the magic wand tool on steroids. You'll see what I mean here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit Shift Tab to get rid of my palettes there on the right hand side. We don't need any palettes for this. And let's go and grab our next sample file. So go ahead and double click on your gray background, head into your project files folder and look for a file called buddha.jpg. Go ahead and pop that guy open. Now, I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. Essentially what I want to do, and this is the challenge here in this sort of exercise, is we want to try and select the Buddha himself, not the books in the background or anything like that. What we want is just the Buddha isolated away from the background. And this is a little Buddha statue that I keep just above my computer on my bookshelf to help me remain calm during frustrating computer experiences. So what I want to do is I want to try and use this color range command, as I say. And as I just mentioned a moment ago, he's very similar to the magic wand tool in that he's going to create a selection based on color, hence the name of the command, color range. But what he's going to do is he's going to select both adjacent and non-adjacent colors. So let's see how this guy's going to work. So I've got my photograph open here. I'm going to head up to the select menu up at the top. Halfway down, color range. All right, now inside the color range dialog box, let's just make sure of a few things here first. Down at the bottom, make sure your selection preview is set to none. I'll talk about that guy in just a moment. You'll see how that plays out. Now, inside the dialog box, there's some weird stuff going on here. We have a thumbnail preview of our image, but it looks kind of weird and wacky. There's blacks and whites and shades of gray there. This thumbnail here represents what we have selected inside our image. And notice, by the way, when I bring my cursor out of the dialog box, the cursor changes to an eyedropper. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and click on my Buddha statue to select the statue. Maybe I'll click down towards sort of the bottom left of his Buddha belly there. I'll single click there. Actually, that's not bad, because how this works here is when I click here inside the image, back inside the dialog box, this thumbnail here, as I say, represents what we have selected. So areas that are filled with black are not selected. Areas that are filled with white are selected. And areas that are filled with shades of gray are semi-selected, if that makes sense. Now, before I get going too crazy here, here's a few things that I want to bounce off you. So I went into my image, I clicked on the statue there, and I can click in different areas, by the way, to try and get the best selection possible here. In other words, what I want to try and do is get as much of the statue selected there as I can. But what's cool here as well is, do you remember when we were working with the magic wand tool, we had a tolerance field? And the tolerance field allowed us to control how much color was being selected. Well, that's exactly what the fuzziness slider does here in the color range. So in other words, the fuzziness slider is going to increase or decrease the tolerance. So if I drop this guy way down and then say click on his Buddha belly here, I don't get much selected there at all. Let me try clicking around here a little bit. I get some, but not much, right? If I crank his fuzziness way up, say into the hundreds there, about 120, and then I start clicking around, I'm getting a lot more of the statue selected, which is great. You can also see, though, that I'm getting a lot of the background selected there as well. So now what I can do is I can use my Shift key on the keyboard to add to my selection. So I can click around in the image here to add areas to my selection, my Buddha selection here. Or what I can do, actually that's not bad, I'm doing an okay job here to my great surprise. Or what I can do is I can hold down Alt or Option to subtract areas from my selection. And as we're working here, you'll notice a little minus sign beside our eyedropper tool while I'm holding down Option here on the Mac or Alt on the Windows side. Or, of course, a plus sign beside my eyedropper tool when I'm holding down Shift, right? So this is really the idea here, coming in here and getting the best selection possible. Now, I think in an image like this, we're going to be able to do okay, but we won't be able to get a very precise selection just because there's so much color in the background behind our Buddha statue. So again, at any time I can come back and adjust my fuzziness slider here, maybe something like this, and then I'll just hold down Shift and I'll kind of come into the statue here and just try and do the best that I can here. I think that's looking okay. Something like that there, I think. All right, that looks all right. So as I say, you might need to experiment a little bit. Now, I mentioned this selection preview drop-down menu. Now, the default is none, but I had mine set to grayscale previously from a previous image I was working on. So if I switch to grayscale, now I get this preview inside my document window. And again, I can hold down Shift or Alt or Option and come along and clean this up a little bit. Or what I can do is I can switch to black matte, something like that. So again, black areas are not selected. Areas that look normal, like a normal photograph, are selected. And we have a few other options here as well. We have white mask. You can certainly use that. So again, now white areas are not selected. Or I can use something called quick mask. And I mentioned quick mask not too long ago. With the quick mask preview, now areas that are not selected are covered in this sort of this red overlay, this red ruby leaf. And of course, we'll be talking more about the quick mask mode very shortly. So for now, I think I'm going to go back to normal or none there. You can set that selection preview menu to really whatever you want. Now, there's one more thing that I want to show you here. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option. And you may recall this from earlier. My cancel button now changes to a reset button. So I'm going to reset my dialog box, essentially, going all the way back to where I started. And we have this option here, localized color clusters. Now, I don't find this very useful myself, but I'll show you how this works here. I'm going to turn this guy on, and then I'll click on my Buddha belly there. And what happens is now this range slider, by the way, ungrays, and I can use the range slider here. And essentially what happens is wherever I click now becomes selected, and then it tapers off in an oval or a circular fashion like this. So in other words, if I click, say, on his upper chest there, that then becomes the center point, and it tapers off from there. Now, it's entirely up to you if you want to use this option here. I don't find myself using it all too often, but every once in a blue moon. Anyway, I'm going to uncheck that guy, and I'll go back and I'll try and make a decent selection here, back to where you and I were not too long ago. And again, you know what? If your selection isn't perfect, don't worry about it, because we're going to clean our selection up using this thing called the quick mask mode in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. And of course, my screen is filled with marching ants, and it's pretty tough to tell what is selected and what isn't selected. And obviously, this selection needs a lot of refinement, a lot of cleanup, because again, it's just the Buddha statue that I want, not all the stuff in the background. So we'll use the quick mask mode next to refine this selection. Okay, are you ready for it? Photoshop's quick mask mode. I think you're really going to like this. A lot of people fall in love with the quick mask mode. This is arguably the easiest way to create selections and masks inside Photoshop. And the reason why it's so easy to work with is because we're going to be creating selections, or in our case here, refining a selection simply by painting with Photoshop's paintbrush tool. It's that easy. So, you know, I wanted to show you the color range command in the previous exercise, but normally when I'm showing this, I suggest to start with some kind of a selection. You could use the magic wand tool or the color range command, of course, or really whatever you want, just to get a rough selection, and we don't want it to be perfect because we're going to refine it in the quick mask mode. So I hope you're ready for this. All right, what I'd like you to do is hit the D key on your keyboard, and that will ensure that your foreground color is black and your background color is white. And the next thing that I'd like you to do is either click on this button just below your color area there inside your toolbox, or simply hit the Q key on your keyboard, and that'll flip you into Photoshop's quick mask mode. Now, whether you know it or not, we're inside the quick mask mode here. What happens is we lose all of our marching ants, and the marching ants are replaced with this red color overlay, or this red ruby lith. And how it works is areas that are covered by this red ruby lith are not selected, and areas that appear normal, like most of my Buddha, are selected. Now, what's really cool here is as we're refining our selection and as we're fixing it up and making it perfect, we can flip back and forth between the quick mask mode and the regular old Photoshop mode just by tapping the Q key on our keyboard. So there, I'm back to marching ants, I'm back to the regular old Photoshop, hit Q again, now I'm back into the quick mask mode. All right, now during this process, I should warn you, there's going to be a lot of zooming in and out. There's going to be a lot of flipping between the regular Photoshop mode and the quick mask mode. There's going to be a lot of painting and erasing and things like this. So let's get started here. I'm going to hit the B key on my keyboard, and what that does is that flips me over to the paintbrush tool over inside the toolbox. And what I'm going to do is zoom in on my Buddha statue, nice and close, maybe something like this, 200%, or maybe even a little bit closer. And we have two areas that we need to touch up inside our image, the inside of the statue and the outside of the statue. So earlier, if you recall, I said I didn't want the background selected at all. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start filling in the background area with red. So in other words, I want the background area here to be completely filled in with red. So how do I do that? Well, how it works here, and you'll definitely want to write this down because everybody always forgets this. When we paint with black, that's going to add to the red ruby lith, thus removing or subtracting from our selection. Let me show you what I mean here. So I have black as my foreground color down in the color area of my toolbox. I'm on my paintbrush tool. From the options bar up at the top, I'm going to go and crank up my brush size nice and big, maybe around 40, 45, or 50, something like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start painting. And what happens here is you can see it appears that I'm painting in red, even though I have black as my foreground color swatch, right? So as I'm painting along here, and maybe I'll just do sort of the edge of this book here. This is actually an Oxford English dictionary here. Something like this. And then if I go back into the regular old Photoshop mode, I'll just hit my Q key again. That whole area is now filled in. So in other words, I just removed that entire area, the spine of this book, from my selection. And again, this is painting with black. So again, painting with black adds to the red ruby lith, the red overlay, thus subtracting from the selection. Okay, great. I hope we have that straight. I'm going to go back into the quick mask mode just by tapping the Q key on my keyboard. And now what I'll do is I will switch and I'll start painting with white, which will subtract from the red ruby lith, thus adding to the selection. Does that make sense? So painting with white is going to remove the red overlay, the red ruby lith, and add to my selection. So, for example, I'm going to try doing the Buddha's face here, and you can see there's some red in there. So that is areas that are not selected inside my statue. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the X key on my keyboard, and what the X key does is it flips the foreground and background colors for me. So you want to make sure that white is in the foreground. So now we're going to be painting with white, and all I'm going to do is paint over top of the Buddha's face. In fact, I'm not even really being careful about it. I'm just kind of scribbling over top of his face, just kind of getting rid of all these red areas. Something like that. Okay, now let's go and check our work here. I'm going to hit the Q key on my keyboard again, and all the marching ants, well, it looks like I missed a spot right over his eye there, but most of the marching ants anyway that were in his face are now gone. Let me give you a better example. I'll just pan down here a little bit. We have some marching ants in here, and he's wearing this beaded necklace here. I'll hit the Q key. Sure enough, I can see a lot of red in there. I'm just painting over top of that. Again, I'm painting with white to get rid of that red ruby lith overlay. Something like this. All right, great. Just giving you a quick example here. Hit the Q key. Marching ants are gone. That's how it works. All right, so now the task that we have ahead of ourselves is to essentially fill the entire background with red and remove all of the red from the interior of our Buddha statue. So I'm going to flip back to my quick mask mode here. Again, just Q on my keyboard. And you know, as a matter of fact, I want to be a little bit more specific here with you. What I want to do is I want to fill the entire background with red but I want to only worry about getting a nice refined edge all the way around my statue. I'm not really worried about the red on the interior of the statue, if that makes sense. I'm going to show you an extremely cool trick for wiping out all of the stuff on the inside of the statue, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. But in the meantime, what I'm going to have to do, and I'll do most of this off camera, by the way, because I don't want to bore you to death. This could take some time. I might be committing myself to probably the better part of an hour to do a really good job on this. Maybe about 45 minutes or so. But essentially what I want to do, and I always just sort of pick a spot on the edge here, is I now want to work around the entire edge, the entire contour of the object, whether it's a Buddha statue or a car or a person or whatever you have here. So in this situation, what I want to do is I now want to paint with red. I want to fill in this background here. So I'm going to have to hit the X key on my keyboard to flip back over to the black in my foreground color there and just paint this in here. But you'll notice that I'm getting a soft edge there. So what I actually want to do is I want to change my brush. I want a hard edged brush instead of this sort of this feathered effect that I'm getting here. So again, from the drop down here at the top, what I'm going to do is drop down this brush dialog and crank up my hardness all the way to 100. Enter, and now I have a nice hard edged brush. And I'll come into the statue a bit so you can see what I mean. So this is a nice hard-edged brush versus the soft edge that I had earlier. Now this is my own personal technique for working using a hard-edged brush. It's entirely up to you. So now that I've come into the statue a bit, I'm going to hit the X key again to flip back to white and then kind of work my way around the edge of the Buddha statue, something like this. So I have a nice crisp edge. And, you know, you might even want to zoom in a little closer. You don't want to go too crazy with all this, but you want to do a half-decent job at least. And, you know, if this is your first time using the quick mask mode, you know, don't go crazy. Do the best you can, but, you know, don't spend more than an afternoon. Don't spend more than a couple days on it. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention as well, and you may recall this keyboard shortcut from earlier on, is I can use the close square bracket key to increase my brush size, and there I was tapping my open square bracket key to reduce the size of my brush. So saves you the trouble of going back up to the top and adjusting your size. So again, close square bracket increases, open square bracket decreases your brush size. So I can get right in on these areas here and clean this up. And there's a lot of, you know, while you're doing this, there's a lot of hitting the X key, going back and forth. There's a lot of closed square bracket and open square bracket. There's a lot of zooming in and out to do a decent job. There's a lot of space bar to pan around inside your image, this sort of thing. So I'm going to leave the rest up to you. Do a decent job. I'm going to start going on my Buddha here, and then in the next lesson what I'll do is I'll show you a couple of neat tricks to hopefully speed this up a little bit for you. Okay, so my Buddha is coming along. It's by no means perfect, and it's by no means complete, but I'm just kind of, you know, working away on it here. And wanted to show you a couple of quick ideas, a couple of quick things, quick techniques that you can use to help you along and to sort of speed things up here for you. So you may recall that a lot of the background was selected and I didn't want that area selected. So if I hit my Q key on the keyboard, you can see that my selection is now really getting restricted just to the statue itself. A lot of the background stuff has been knocked away. Let me show you how I did that. I did a couple of different things. First of all, what I did is I cranked up my brush size nice and big. Again, just using that closed square bracket key on my keyboard. Maybe not that big, but about there. And I just kind of took out these huge swaths, just kind of big brush strokes to get rid of that stuff. And you know, here's something else that I did too, and you're really going to like this, is I realized this a few years ago. I realized, well, hey, wait a minute. I know that I can fill a selection with color, and when I'm inside Photoshop's quick mask mode, I can use my selection tools, like my rectangular selection tool here. So what you can literally do is, even though you're working on a selection, you can make another selection. So literally just drag out this massive rectangle, and then, you know, you could hold down Shift and you could add in more areas, taking out these big chunks of background kind of as you go, something like this, right? Way down to his shoulder, and down his side, you know what I mean? Something like that. And then just fill the entire thing with, in our case, red, which in my situation right now, so we want to fill him with black. So my black is in the background. So that would be Command Delete. Remember that keyboard shortcut, or Control Delete on the Windows side? Or if black is in your foreground, I just hit my X key there, I would hit Option Delete or Alt Delete to fill in that selection. So you can use your selection tools inside the Quick Mask mode, which is awesome. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, let me show you a couple of other neat techniques that I sometimes use here. I'm just going to deselect, and I'll go back to my brush tool just by hitting the B key on my keyboard. And let me see if I can find a good spot here. I'm going to zoom in on my statue here, and I'll reduce down my brush size. Sometimes it's hard to tell, right in here for instance, sometimes it's hard to tell where the statue ends and where the background begins, particularly if you have a shadow like I have in here, right? Or, you know, I noticed this as well further up the side of the statue on his face there with the shadow against the books there coming off the flash on my camera versus the edge of the statue. I'm not really sure where that edge is, right? So either of those locations would be fine. I'm going to go back down here. Here's what I'll do sometimes. Back to my brush tool here. What I'll do is I'll just kind of guess where that edge is. Maybe I'll start down here where I can see the edge. And I want to make sure that white is my foreground color. So I'm going to be removing from that red ruby lith. And all I'm doing is I'm just following this line. See the edge of the statue there. I'm just following that around. I suppose what I could do is I could hit the Q key and go, all right, it continues up against that white book, and there's the edge of his hand. But I mean, that's going to be a lot of going back and forth, right? So a lot of times I'll just kind of follow that edge all the way around as I go, something like this. And then there, I can totally see where the edge of the statue is now against the edge of the spine of that white book, something like that. And then what I'll do is then I'll come back and I'll clean this up a little bit. I'll flip back to black now in the foreground and then carefully come back and paint this background back in. You know what I mean? Something like that. But in any regard, that's just a technique that I use sometimes. You don't have to use it. Or, you know, I'm sure as you start using this more and more, you'll start developing your own techniques and you'll find what works for you and what seems to give you the best results, this sort of thing, right? So it's all sort of a matter of feel here. But at the end of the day, it's a great way to, again, create selections here inside Photoshop simply by painting them. So I'm going to leave the rest of the statue up to you. I'll catch up with you in just a few minutes and I'll show you what we can then do with our selection. What we'll do is we're going to save the selection. I'll show you how to do that, which converts the selection to something called an alpha channel, and then I'll show you how to edit your alpha channel. So sit tight for that. In the meantime, finish up your selection as best you can, and don't forget, leave some junk on the inside of the statue. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just the outside sort of contour of the statue is really what we're after. All right, how's your Buddha looking? I hope it looks half decent. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, just something that we can work with here. And once again, another gentle reminder of the same thing here. Really what we want is a nice crisp edge. You can see that I've gone all the way around the sort of the contour of the statue. I really haven't done much in terms of the interior of the statue. It's that outside edge that I want to make sure is in place. So I'm going to show you how to clean up the inside very quickly in just a little while. But at this point, I'm happy with what I've done here. I hope you've enjoyed the quick mask mode inside Photoshop. And again, it's such an awesome way to create selections. Now what I want to do is I want to save my selections. So what I'm going to do is I'll head back into regular old Photoshop just by hitting my Q key on the keyboard. And what I want to do now is, as I say, save this selection so that it becomes part of my file. Now, just so you know as well, as I started working along inside the quick mask mode, I thought, you know, I should probably save my file. So I renamed my file. I chose File Save As, and I saved them as buddha.psd, and I stuck them on my desktop, along with our statue, if you remember, that composite image we created way back when. So that now the selection that you and I have been working on is going to be saved along with our file after this next step. And what happens here is the selection gets saved as something called an alpha channel. Now I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's go and save our selection here first, and then we'll talk about alpha channels. So I have my marching ants here. They're not perfect, but that's fine. I'm going to head up to the select menu all the way up at the top, and then the very last command, save selection. Go ahead and choose that guy. and we wind up with this Save Selection dialog box. What file do we want to save the selection in? Well, obviously this one, buddha.psd in my case. The channel, make sure that's set to new. Now, what's up with channel? You'll see how that plays out. And then it's prompting us for a name. So I'm simply going to call this Buddha. How's that? Okay. And the operation here, new channel, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. All right, now I'm just going to switch over to my Move tool for a moment. Now, the next thing that I want you to do, and I want you to trust me on this, is we're going to deselect. We're going to get rid of our marching ants. Even though you and I have spent a whole bunch of time creating the perfect selection here, or the near perfect selection, I'm going to get rid of my marching ants. So in other words, if we hadn't saved our selection and we lost our marching ants, you and I would have to start all over again from scratch, which is brutal. I've done it in the past. It's awful. It's a horrifying feeling to have to start all over again. But you and I just saved our selection. So that means at any point now that I've saved my file as a .psd, a week from now or a month from now, I can come back to this file and I can reload those marching ants at any point, which is awesome. So check this out. I'm going to go back to the select menu and then down to load selection. And inside the load selection dialog box, the document that I want to load the selection from is this one. The channel that I want to load in is Buddha. And notice I have the option to invert the selection as well. So maybe I don't want the statue to be selected. I want the background to be selected. Anyway, I'm going to make sure that that's unchecked. And then go ahead and click on OK. All right, there's our marching ants back. You know, many years ago, when I first got into saving selections, I was scared to death to deselect because I didn't want to lose my marching ants. And then I realized I can pull back my selection whenever I want. So maybe I run a couple of special effects, or maybe I apply some color correction, and then I get rid of my marching ants. And then next week I come back and I go select, and I go down to load selection, grab my Buddha channel, my saved selection, click on OK, and he's back exactly the way that I left him. Perfect. All right, now go ahead and deselect once again, get rid of your marching ants. I now want to show you exactly what's going on here. I said this earlier, and again, I was kind of getting ahead of myself, but Photoshop saves the selection as something called an alpha channel. So let's go and take a look at that alpha channel. Let's see what we can do with it, and let's see if we can clean up our selection and make it perfect. Okay, so what's this thing called an alpha channel, and where is it stored, and how does it work? Well, one thing that I want to point out here before we dig into this thing called an alpha channel, and I don't want to go too far off the deep end here with you, but notice up on my document tab, it says the file name there, buddha.psd, the current zoom, and then of course in brackets, as we recall from earlier, the color mode, or the number of colors. So my Buddha statue, my Buddha photo, is an RGB image. So it's made up of red, green, and blue, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and open up Photoshop's Channels palette. And what the Channels palette does is it provides color information based on my image. So I'm going to head to the window menu and then all the way down to Channels. Look for Channels inside your window menu. And here we go. Now inside the channels palette, we have what's referred to as a composite channel at the top. So red, green, and blue all together. Then we have a red channel, then we have a green channel, then we have a blue channel. Now, all of this is just sort of background information for you based on your channels. I didn't want to dump into the channel palette and then have you wondering exactly what channels are and how they work. But the important thing to note is the Buddha channel all the way down at the bottom. So this is our alpha channel sitting down here at the bottom of the channels palette. And as a quick aside, a lot of people confuse channels with layers. I can't take my Buddha channel and drag them above the RGB and change the stacking order and all that kind of stuff. This is more just relaying color information to me, the user. That's really all there is to it. Now, remember earlier we were loading in our selection, right? Well, a faster way to go about loading in your alpha channel as a selection, which is exactly what we do, by the way, when we head up to the select menu and then down to load selection. Instead of doing that, what we can do is hold down the control key over on the Windows side or the command key here on the Mac and simply click on our alpha channel thumbnail. And that'll load in that alpha channel as a selection, as marching ants. Just kind of a cool thing that you can do there. But you know, more importantly, what I want to do here is I want to clean up my alpha channel. I want to clean up my selection so that it's absolutely perfect. What I'm referring to, of course, is all of the marching ants inside the Buddha statues. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get rid of my marching ants by deselecting Command D or Control D, of course, and then try clicking on your Buddha alpha channel. And of course, that alpha channel then gets loaded into the main image window. And it loads in as a mask. So it's going to be made up of solid black, solid white, and shades of gray. And again, shades of gray would indicate partial selection, right? Now, the important thing to remember here, and there's a bit of a goofy rhyme that I always use to help me remember, is areas of white are revealed, they are selected. Areas of black are not selected, they're concealed. So white reveals, black conceals. You might want to jot that down in your notes or again on a sticky note. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to zoom in just a little bit on my Buddha statue here. And I'm going to switch back to my paintbrush tool just by hitting the B key on my keyboard. And what I can do here is I can literally paint on my alpha channel. So in other words, right now my foreground color is white, so I'll hit the X key to flip over to black, and I can actually paint in any of the white areas. I can paint that in to further refine my selection. In other words, I'm actually editing my saved selection at this point. So of course what we would really want to do is we'd want to make sure that white is our foreground color, and maybe I'll crank up my brush size, something like this, and literally just take out huge swaths of the black that I see inside my sort of the silhouette, if you will, of the statue, and just kind of come in here, clean it all up, do the best I can here. Something like this, right? All right, so you know what? I'm going to leave it up to you to clean up the rest of your selection. Do the best that you can. This is why I said back in the quick mask mode that what we really want and what's most important is getting that edge defined around the statue, right? The inside, I said, doesn't matter so much. The important stuff is the outside. So now on the alpha channel, I can clean up all this stuff that's on the inside. Okay, so I'm going to leave it up to you to clean it up, and then I'll show you how this is going to play out in just a second. Cleaning up the inside of the Buddha statue actually went really quick. It only took me a couple of seconds here just to kind of clean things up. All I did is I just tapped my close square bracket key a few times, of course still on the brush tool, and just took out massive chunks of the black that was in there. And then I zoomed in a little closer and did some of the detail work. So hopefully all good. Now here's the cool part. Now that we've adjusted the alpha channel, this is all on the alpha channel, right? The cool thing is that we also edited the saved selection, because don't forget the selection is coming off of the alpha channel. So whatever happens on this Buddha alpha channel is going to happen whenever I reload the selection, right? Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to hit the V key on my keyboard. Inside the channels palette, I'm going to click on the first channel, this composite channel there, and that takes me all the way back to where you and I started. And then I'll go back to the select menu, back down to load selection, and then of course I'm going to load in my Buddha selection. I'll click on OK, and there we are. I'm going to zoom in here for you so you can see this here. A perfect Buddha selection. Well, as perfect as I can make it anyway. So there's no marching ants on the inside of the statue. I have a nice selection all the way around the outside of this fella, which is great. So now at this point I can do any number of things. I can apply an effect. I could pull him off the background, pull him off this bookshelf and put him somewhere else. Combine him with some elements from some other photos if I want, or run some color correction, or really whatever I want, right? So again, it's really about getting perfect selections here inside Photoshop, and I think using the quick mask mode inside Photoshop, and then of course saving your selections and refining them via the channels palette, via alpha channels, is definitely a way to go. So there you go. Now there's lots more to talk about in terms of working with masks and refining selections here in Photoshop, so let's keep going. You know, with all this talk of the quick mask mode and alpha channels and masking and perfecting selections and all the rest of it, we can actually take this one step further, and I can introduce you to a new dialog box inside Photoshop CS5 called the Refine Edge dialog box. Well, you know, actually it isn't new in Photoshop CS5. However, it's been completely revamped in this latest version of Photoshop. So let me show you how this is going to play out here. Now, as the name would imply with this dialog box, it's going to allow us to refine our selections, refine our masks even further. So I'm exactly where we left off from the previous exercise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and grab any selection tool out of the toolbox. Go ahead and grab any of them there. It doesn't really matter which one. And then up on the options bar across the top, I'm going to go and click on Refine Edge. And that'll bring you into this dialog box here. Okay, now lots to show you here. First of all, I think the best place to start would be in the view mode right at the top of the dialog box. And essentially what I can do here is I can set how I want Photoshop to display the mask, the selection that I'm working on. And you know, this drop-down menu here, this reminds me of the drop-down menu that we saw at the bottom of the color range dialog box way back when. So essentially what I could do is I could say, just show me marching ants, like the regular photo with the selection there. Or I could drop this guy down and I could say, show me this overlay, this quick mask, red ruby lith overlay. Or, I mean, any number of other options. On black, which I know some people like. On white, which I prefer myself. It's a little bit cleaner, easier to see. But you know, there's two additional options here that are new inside Photoshop CS5, which is Reveal Layer. So it's going to show you the photograph without the marching ants, which is kind of handy. Or the second guy is On Layers. And what that will do is that will show you the selection and any of the layers that appear underneath it. Now, I should have switched over to my layers palette. There we go. And as you can see, I don't have any layers underneath my Buddha layer. So it's just showing me, again, that checkerboard, that gray and white checkerboard pattern indicating transparency. So there's nothing beneath this guy, right? So you might want to leave it on this guy if you want. Or if we had clouds in the background, you'd see clouds or whatever else you have, right? So in terms of the preview, it's really up to you. It's entirely up to you. I think I'm going to go with the on white. Oh, the one that I didn't show you was black and white, which is our alpha channel, right? You might like that as well. So it's entirely up to you. Then what we can do is we can get to the good stuff in this dialog box, and that is the options that we see inside the Adjust Edge area. So we have Smooth, Feather, Contrast, and Shift Edge. So let's have a look at these guys. So what I'll do is I'll start with my smooth slider. So what I can do is I can come in here and essentially smooth out the edge of my selection. And as I'm dragging this slider, I'm getting an update inside my image, something like this, right? So once again, you might want to zoom in a little bit on your file here, just so you can see really what's happening here. Rough looking, something like that maybe. It's all in the eye of the beholder too as well, of course. Do you know what feathering is? What that will do is that will give me a soft edge, so maybe something more like this, which maybe I want to use for a special effect or something, right? Something like that. So whenever you see feathering options, it means soften the edge. And of course, the higher the feather value, the softer the edge. Well, I don't want very much feathering at all, if any. Maybe I'll have mine all the way down at about 1 pixel, just so it's a little bit soft, so it won't be too hard of an edge. And then we also have contrast. You can use your contrast slider as well to further refine that edge. If I crank up this contrast, you can see how sharp that edge gets, and that looks pretty darn good to me, I think. And then finally, we have Shift Edge, which essentially will shift the edge either inward on our statue. Notice how it's trimming in on the edge of our Buddha statue now. Or we can push it off the edge of our Buddha statue. And now we're going to be getting some of the background in there. You can actually see some of the books that are in the background there and so on. So probably myself, what I would do is I would tuck it in just a little bit, just so we're making sure we don't get any background at all. Now that looks like an awesome selection. So all I did here, just as a quick recap, is really you just fiddle with these sliders until it looks decent. So my smooth is at 33, my feathers at just 1, contrast I brought up to 64%, and I shifted my edge about -7, -5, -7, something like that. When things are looking good for you here, then what we can do is down in the output area, we can decide what kind of output we want. And to me, this is fantastic. The default is selection, so it's just going to create, again, more marching ants for us. Or what I can do is set this guy up as a layer mask, or a new layer with a layer mask. a new document or a new document with a layer mask. Now, we haven't talked about layer masks yet, but we're going to take a look at that next. So I think maybe for now what I'll do is I'll just say new layer. How's that? And then I'll click on OK. All right. So what's happened here is I still have my original Buddha in the background. If I turn him on, and I can shut off the copy that was just created. This is the new guy here. And then I can turn off the background and turn on my new guy, the background copy layer. And there is my absolutely perfectly selected Buddha statue using the Refine Edge dialog box, as well as a combination of a few other things here in Photoshop, like the quick mask mode and the alpha channels. But there you go. That's kind of the massive run through of creating perfect selections, perfect masks in Photoshop. All right, now I promised to show you something called layer masks here in Photoshop, and this is where Photoshop does start to get a little bit more advanced, not like mega advanced, but I would say more in the intermediate range, I will say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and open up another project file. I went and closed out of my Buddha. We're done with him. So I'm going to double click on my gray background there, of course, and into the project files, and I'm looking for a file called trucks.psd. Go ahead and pop that file open. Here we are, 3 toy trucks that I photographed against a fairly white background, although you can see there's a lot of drop shadow in there, again from the lighting and the flash and so on. Now, what I want to try and do is I want to try and essentially isolate just the blue truck here on the right-hand side and get rid of the other 2 trucks, the yellow truck and the red truck. And of course, I want to do so using this thing called a layer mask. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to get started with layer masks, initiating a layer mask, and of course working with them. I think what I'll do here is I'll start you off with the simplest method, and then we'll perhaps get a little bit more involved as we go along here. So I have my layers palette open on the right hand side, and of course inside the layers palette I see my background layer, so I know that I have a flattened image. What I'm going to do is I'm going to convert my background layer into a regular old Photoshop layer by double clicking on them, and then I'll just hit enter on my keyboard, or you can click on OK. So we now have layer 0. You can rename that to blue truck if you want. Doesn't really matter. And then the next thing that I'll do is with layer 0 selected all the way down at the bottom of my layers palette, I'll click on this guy here, add layer mask. Go ahead and click on that guy. Now, something kind of weird happens here. We have the original layer thumbnail where I can see the toy trucks there. And then we have a new thumbnail. This is our layer mask thumbnail. And the chain link that connects the 2 together suggests that both these thumbnails are linked. So the image and the layer mask are going to be connected, at least initially. All right, now that I've done that, what do I do next? Well, check this out. I'm going to go back to my brush tool. This is very similar, by the way, to working with the quick mask mode. So I'm back on my brush tool. And remember that rhyme I gave you not too long ago? Black conceals and white reveals. So make sure you have black as your foreground color. I had to hit the X key there. And then you may need to increase or decrease your brush size. I'm at about this size here, and all I'm going to do is start painting inside my image. In fact, I'm going to paint all the way around the outside of this toy truck, this blue toy truck. That's the guy that I want to keep, remember. So essentially what I'm going to do is wipe out everything else, right? And because black conceals, what I'm doing here is it looks like I'm erasing the image, doesn't it? And of course I can see the checkerboard pattern showing through, indicating transparency, right? Indicating that there's nothing there. There's no pixels there at all. Well, what's interesting to note is I'm not actually deleting any pixels. What I'm doing is I'm masking away pixels. If I look back over inside my layers palette on that thumbnail there, that layer mask thumbnail, the black pixels there are indicating where my transparency resides inside my main image window, or in other words, where the masked areas reside inside my image. Now, you know what's really cool here is if I switch over now to white, don't forget that white reveals, and I start painting, I can actually paint in my image, the areas of the image that I had erased away. Well, again, I hadn't erased them, I merely masked them. So once again, this is one of our non-destructive methods for working inside Photoshop. You know, alternatively, what I could have done is I could have double-clicked on my background layer, converted them to a regular old Photoshop layer. I could have grabbed my eraser tool inside the toolbox and just gone at it and erased away my image just like this, right? And I would have gotten the exact same result, at least visually it would look exactly the same, but I wouldn't have this ability of painting back in the image. Does that make sense? So in other words, let's say, for example, I'm working along the edge of this blue toy truck, and I'm coming along here, and I accidentally take out too much, right? If I had used the eraser tool, then I'm basically toast. I'd have to undo, or I'd have to use my history, because this is all permanent if I had the eraser tool. Well, thankfully we're creating a mask, so I can just hit the X key on my keyboard and just fix up my errors and paint everything back in, or unmask, really, the areas that I had accidentally masked, right? That's really all there is to it. Now, you know, this is one method of initiating a layer mask. I'm going to show you another method here. What I'm going to have you do is revert your file back to the last time that we saved. We haven't saved yet, so it's going to take us all the way back to the beginning here. So I'm going to head up to my File menu and then all the way down to Revert, or of course F12 on your keyboard. And I'll show you another method for initiating a layer mask, and we'll do that next. All right, now you and I have been talking about layer masks, and we're just kind of getting warmed up with the idea of layer masks and how they work. They, again, are very, very similar to the quick mask mode. Now, maybe not initially, but once you really start working with them, you realize, hey, it's practically the same thing. It's just all based inside the layers palette now, hence the name layer mask, right? So initially, you saw how to create a very simple layer mask just by painting. It was very straightforward. I want to show you another method for initiating a layer mask. And of course, we want to try and isolate this blue toy truck here on the right-hand side of our image. This time, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to get started by using a selection. So what I could do, I suppose, is I could use my quick selection tool or my magic wand tool, or I could even maybe use my magnetic lasso tool or my freehand lasso tool to select out this guy. Essentially, that's what I want. But I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do something a little bit different here. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on my background layer to switch him back to a regular old Photoshop layer. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and select the background, and then what I'll do is I'll minus out the other two toy trucks. Hopefully this will play out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my color range command for this, by the way. So up to the select menu and then down to color range. We saw this guy earlier, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in the background of my photograph here, something like this. And once again, you might want to play around a little bit with your fuzziness slider. What I'm trying to do is blow out the background and try and get as much of the vehicles as I can. Maybe something like this, or, you know, I could even, well, no, I can't really drop them any further than about there. I think that's going to be all right for us. Okay, go ahead and click on OK. Okay, so we have the background selected here. And as I say, I want to get rid of the two other trucks, the yellow truck and the red truck. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab my rectangular selection tool, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key, because what I want to do is I want to add these other trucks to the selection. So quite literally, I'm just going to throw down sort of this massive rectangular selection, something like this, and then maybe do just a little bit there to get the little bits of the yellow truck there. It doesn't have to be perfect or anything. Something like this I think is just fine here. Okay, now next up what I want to do is I want to convert this selection to a layer mask. And I'm going to do so from the layer menu. So up to the layer menu here, and then down to layer mask. And we have a bunch of options here. We have reveal all, hide all, reveal the selection, hide the selection, or here's a new one in CS5, from transparency, which is pretty handy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say hide the selection. Now, what that does is that creates for me a layer mask. You can see there inside the layers palettes, we get the exact same setup that you and I had previously. There's my layer mask thumbnail, and because we chose hide selection, the entire selection essentially is filled with black or the entire selection is now transparent down inside our document window. Wonderful. So now all we need to do, if I zoom in here a little bit, is you can see I need to make some adjustments here to my toy truck, and I'm going to do so using the paintbrush tool. So back to the B key on my keyboard, and I'll make sure that the foreground color at the bottom of my toolbox is black. And then essentially what I'll do is I'll paint in the areas that I want to get rid of. And I'm just kind of doing a sort of a simplistic job at this point. And then, of course, the bumper and the fender, sort of the trim there, did not get selected either. So I'm going to have to fill those areas with white. So I'll hit the X key here on my keyboard and then repaint in those areas. So sort of like we did with the quick mask mode and our Buddha statue, I'm going to leave it up to you to get a perfect selection here for our toy truck. And the trickiest part, at least what I'm seeing here, is getting around the tires and around the bottom, the sort of the undercarriage of the toy truck. So I'm going to leave that up to you, and I will catch up with you in just a minute. Now, of course, once again, I'm thinking to myself, how can I speed this up? How can I make this go a little bit faster? I've done an okay job of getting the trim back, painted back in. But, getting underneath the toy truck and around the wheels and stuff is going to be kind of a pain. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to show you kind of a quick trick here. And what's cool about this is we start to combine some of the different techniques and some of the different tools that we've learned up until this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over to my polygonal lasso tool over in the toolbox. I'm going to grab that guy. And what I'm going to do essentially is create a selection here, a straight-edged selection, obviously, with this. And, of course, right across the bottom of the truck there and then around the tire treads. And once again, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. You want to do a decent job, but, just while I'm doing this, I will say this, that you always have to think about, where am I going to use this object? Where is it going to wind up? If it's going to wind up as, a thumbnail graphic on a website, then you don't really want to spend, hours and hours getting, a perfect layer mask. But, if it's going to wind up on a billboard, then you might want to spend a couple of days on it. So it really all depends on sort of the final end result of, the sort of the destination of this image. I'm not going to go all the way around the tire. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to cut across the bottom, something like this. And then just very quickly, I'm going to cut up into the rear wheel, something like this, just to speed this along a little bit here. So yeah, always think about, where am I going to use this image? What's the purpose of this image? Is it really going to be under, heavy scrutiny, or is it, again, just going to be a tiny little graphic on a website somewhere? Okay, something like that looks decent. And then all I want to do is I want to take my selection and fill this guy with the appropriate color. Now I went and turned off my layers. So I'm going to hit the F7 key on my keyboard. And of course, what I want to do is I want to hide this area. Now, does white hide or does black hide? White reveals, black conceals. So what I'm going to do is, myself anyway, black is my background color. So I'm going to hold down Command or Control and hit the Delete key on my keyboard to fill that area with black and then deselect. And then essentially what I would do is continue working around my image. Now I'm not too happy with my tire treads there. They look a little gaudy, but you get the idea anyway. And I could essentially do the same thing, underneath the sort of the rear of the truck down in here. I could essentially do the same idea. Cut across here, again with the polygonal lasso tool, or really any of your selection tools. You might want to try a different tool here to see if you can get sort of a better result. All right, I'm just going to keep this short and sweet here for you, this little piece here, there, and then just fill them with black. Command Delete or Control Delete there on the Windows side. Zoom out, have a look at them. There, that's not looking too bad. So as you can see, I still have a ways to go, but there's a couple of neat techniques, a couple of neat tricks for you. All right, how's your layer mask coming along? I hope you're having fun here. I hope you're doing a half-decent job. Now do you see what I mean about it being very similar to the quick mask mode? So again, as you're refining your quick mask, as you're refining things here, again, it's a lot of back and forth between the white and the black, hitting the X key on your keyboard, and using your square brackets on your keyboard to increase and decrease your brush size. Just trying to do a decent job here. A lot of zooming in in and out. And it really works in a similar way. Again, if you cut in too far, then you can always paint things back, right? Again, we're non-destructive here, which is fantastic. Now, you know, as I was working along, I realized that I should probably show you a couple of neat tricks, a couple of neat techniques that you can make use of to make sure you're getting a decent selection, a decent mask happening here. So check this out. So here's technique number one. What I'm going to do, of course I'm still on my paintbrush, is I want to make sure that I don't have any transparent areas on the inside of my truck. I want to make sure that I covered all of the bumper and all the trim and the interior and all the rest of it, right? So what I can do is I can hold down the command key or the control key over on the Windows side and click on the mask thumbnail inside the layers palette, and that will load your mask as a selection, as marching ants. And then if I zoom in just a little bit here, you know, I'm going to hit Shift Tab on my keyboard a couple of times just to get rid of my palettes. I want to make sure that I don't have any marching ants on the inside here, and it's looking really good. Doesn't look like there's any marching ants in there, which is awesome. So again, just a neat little trick that you can use there. I'm just going to hit F7 again to bring my layers palette back, and I'll deselect here. Command D or Control D. And, you know, the other thing that I wanted to mention as well is I can hold down the Option key or the Alt key again there on the Windows side, and I can click on the mask thumbnail. And now what I get is almost like we saw, well, actually, you know what? Exactly what we saw earlier when we were messing around with our alpha channel. So now I get a mask that is solid black and solid white. And again, shades of gray are partial selections, right? And I realized, well, maybe my selection wasn't as good as I thought it was, because I can see a lot of black in the, for example, in the hubcaps there, the rims of the toy truck. I can see some white or some grayish areas on the outside of my truck, and all the way down myself here anyway, in the bottom right corner, there's a huge area there that's not done properly. And if I move around inside my image, it looks like, well, actually I missed a strip there over on the far left side as well. So again, just with my paintbrush tool here, and black is my foreground color, I'm just going to go around and make sure that I've got a perfect selection here. So, you know, I'll do most of this, you know, off camera, but this is just kind of giving you the idea here. Flip over to white and make sure that I have everything nice and clean and perfect here. Again, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but you want to do a half-decent job anyway. Don't forget, zooming in is always a good idea. So I would basically make my way around the image and kind of clean it up as best I can, right? Now, that's another thing that I can do here. Now, to get back to sort of regular old Photoshop, what I'll do is I'll hold down Option or Alt again and click on my layer mask thumbnail once more, and that brings me back to where you and I were. So isn't that something? It looks really good here, but again, holding down Alt or Option and clicking on that thumbnail, and I realized, well, I didn't do as good a job as I thought I had, right? So anyway, a neat little trick there. Now, I want to show you one more thing here. I'm going to flip over to my Move tool just by hitting the V key on my keyboard. And if I try and move my truck, no problem. It moves on that transparent background, no problem, right? And that's because the image, this thumbnail, if you will, the layer thumbnail, is moving with the mask thumbnail. The two are connected, remember. Don't forget, there's that link there. But check this out, and this delves into the world, perhaps, of special effects. What I could do here is I could unlink the two. So now I still have my layer mask selected. And by the way, I can tell he's selected because I see these little sort of these angle lines in the corners there to indicate that he's selected. And now if I drag, I'm actually moving the mask, not the truck. Kind of weird. Let me undo that. Command Z or Control Z there on the Windows side. And I'll do the opposite. I'll grab the image thumbnail, so I click over on this guy, and now I drag and I move the trucks, but the mask stays where it is. Really wacky stuff. You might have a use for this, I have no idea. Once again, I'm going to undo that though, and I will relink the two together just by clicking between their thumbnails, and now when I drag one, I drag both. So there you go, there's layer masks anyway. I want to show you now what to do with your layer mask, now that you've actually gone to the effort of cleaning them up and making them perfect. And, you know, once again, maybe you Alt or Option click on this thumbnail and you make them even better, clean them all up. Then what do you do with them? Well, let me show you what you can actually do with your layer masks once you get them perfect. So what do you do with your layer mask now that it's completely finalized and you've really worked out all of the imperfections in your mask? Well, you know, one more time here. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and click here. I couldn't help myself. It had to be perfect. And it's still not absolutely perfect, but I really wanted to clean this up and get it, more to a sort of a final state. So now what? Now what do I do? Well, let me just zoom out just a little bit here. What I can do now really is any number of things. I'm going to head to my layer menu up at the top and then back down to layer mask. And we have some options here. I could choose delete, which would delete the layer mask and take me all the way back to the 3 trucks, all the way back to where we started. Or I could say apply. Now check this out. I'm going to choose apply. It removes the layer mask. It actually sort of applies the layer mask to the image, really, hence the command. The other 2 toy trucks are gone, and all I'm left with is the selection or the mask that you and I had created, right? Now I'm going to undo that. I'm going to have to use my history as well because I moved my guy around. So I'm going to choose edit and then step backward and then edit, step backward. And I'm back to my mask there inside the layers palette. So I can certainly apply a layer mask if I wanted to. I'm going to go back to the layer menu here and then back down to layer mask. I can also disable the layer mask as well. And if I choose that, what happens is, well, it appears that I'm taken all the way back to where we had started. But check out the layers palette. I'm just going to zoom in here on my image. You can see that the mask thumbnail now has this red X through it, indicating that it's disabled. So I see my other 2 toy trucks. And a shortcut for temporarily disabling your layer mask is just holding down the Shift key and clicking on that icon. So enabling and disabling just by Shift clicking on it. But I gotta be honest, myself, I would probably leave the toy truck exactly the way it is. In other words, once I get my layer mask looking perfect, looking exactly the way I want it, I don't do anything. I leave it the way it is, and then I add in some additional images, maybe some other graphic files and so on, create some kind of a composition, but I always leave the layer mask intact because who knows? Down the road, I might have, a need for the yellow truck or maybe the red truck, right? And I don't want to permanently delete them. Again, I like to keep everything as editable as possible. But myself, I would probably just leave it exactly the way it is. In other words, I get my layer mask looking good, looking the way I want, and then I don't do anything. I leave it the way it is. I want to keep it editable. I want to be able to temporarily disable it, or I want to be able to add to the mask or subtract from the mask. So I would leave it as is, and then perhaps drop it into another layout or add some other files to this file and build up some kind of a composition. But I leave the layer mask intact so that I can always go back and edit it. Again, I like that option of editability, right, inside my Photoshop files. So there you go. So if you are indeed working on a different file, if you're working on your own layer mask inside your own file, just make sure to save your document as a .psd, and you'll always have an editable file. So there you go, layer masks. Now, there is yet another form of masking here inside Photoshop, something called clipping groups, which I've got to show you. They're really cool, and they're really easy to work with, and I use clipping groups all the time in my work. Again, yet another non-destructive way to work inside Photoshop. And what I'm going to do here is, in this exercise, I'm going to show you the basics of clipping groups and kind of get you comfy with the idea. And then in the next lesson, what I'll do is I'll show you more of a practical, real-world application of clipping groups. And in this exercise, what I'll do is I'll throw a couple of other quick things at you, little things here in Photoshop that I haven't had an opportunity to show you yet. So I don't have any files open here, obviously. I've closed out of all of my open files. And what I'm going to do is I want to go and create a brand new blank Photoshop file, which I don't think I've done yet with you in this course anyway. So what I'm going to do is, well, I could choose File New, I suppose. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command N or Control N there over on the Windows side. And what I want to do is I've already set up my dialog box here. Just make sure yours is the same as well. My width and height are both set to 5 inches. So type in 5 for both the width and height. And make sure your unit of measurement is set to inches there as well. And then my resolution I've set to 300 pixels per inch. Okay, when you have that in place, go ahead and click on OK. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I essentially want to create a circle in the dead center of this document, and there's a really easy way to pull this off. What I want to do is I want to use rulers and guides here in Photoshop, and if you've used rulers and guides in any of your other Adobe programs, it's exactly the same thing. What I want to do is I want to turn on my rulers, and I'll do so by hitting Command R or Control R, again over on the Windows side, and you should get your horizontal ruler running across the top of your document and your vertical ruler running down the left-hand side. Now I want to create my ruler guides, and if you've never worked with guides before, essentially they're on-screen visual aids to help you lay out your documents. We use them in InDesign and in Illustrator, and of course here in Photoshop as well. So here's what I'm going to do. What I want to do is I want to find the dead center of this document. So our document is obviously 5 inches wide and 5 inches in height. So what I want to do is I want to place a guide at the 2.5 inch mark on the horizontal ruler and another guide at the 2.5 inch mark on the vertical ruler. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring my cursor into the vertical ruler, anywhere sort of inside that vertical space there, and I'm simply going to click and drag out, and that's going to create my guide for me. And I'm going to move my guide. I'm keeping my eyeball up on my horizontal ruler running across the top of my document, and I'm going to drop this guy, as I say, right at the 2.5 inch mark, right there. Okay, perfect. And we should get this light blue line there. This is our guide. It's a non-printing guide, by the way. Let's essentially do the same thing for our vertical ruler. So I'll bring my cursor now into my horizontal ruler. Anywhere inside this space here, click and drag down and drop this guy at the 2.5 inch mark on the vertical ruler, just like that. All right, wonderful. We know where the exact center of our document is now. So I'm going to turn off my rulers, again, just by hitting Command R or Control R on the Windows side. Next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my elliptical selection tool or my circle selection tool. So over inside the toolbox, I'll go and grab him, this fella right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my crosshair right over top of the center point there where my two guides converge, and I want to create a perfect circle from the dead center. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Option here on the Mac or Alt on the Windows side and click and drag, and that's going to create my oval selection from the center. But don't forget, I wanted a perfect circle, right? So while I'm holding down Option or Alt, I'm also going to hold down Shift simultaneously, and that'll constrain my selection to a perfect circle. So what I'm after is something about that size. Okay, perfect. We're almost done here. The next thing that I'm going to do is over inside the Layers palette, I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new layer. So of course I have my background layer there. I'll go and create a new layer here. And you might want to rename this guy. You could call him Circle or something like this. You know what I'm going to do though? I'm going to call mine Cookie Cutter. Now, I know that sounds kind of strange, but stick with me here. So, cookie cutter. Okay. Now, what I want to do with my cookie cutter layer is I want to fill my selection. And here's the trick. The color that you use to fill your selection doesn't really matter. You could fill it with white. You won't see it because it would be white on a white background, right? Obviously. Or you could fill it with black or gray or green or whatever. It doesn't really matter what you fill it with so long as you fill it with something, right? So what I'm going to do here anyway is I have black as my foreground color swatch. That's what I'll use to fill my selection. So I'm going to hold down Option here and hit Delete on my keyboard to fill with the foreground color. You've seen this a couple of times already. And then finally, I will deselect, Command D to get rid of my marching ants, Control D there on the Windows side. And I want to temporarily turn off my guides as well. I don't really need them anymore. So check this out. I'm going to hold down Command or again Control and try hitting the semicolon key right next door to your L key on your keyboard. Hit that guy, and that will temporarily turn off your guides. They're still there. I can hit Control or Command semicolon to turn on and shut off my guides. Kind of a neat trick. Okay, so we have our setup here. Now, what about this thing called a clipping group? Well, what I'm going to do here is I've kind of ran long here, so I'm going to get into the basics of clipping groups next, and then in the following exercise, I'll give you that real-world example. So let's get into the basics of clipping groups next. Okay, I hope you're ready here for the basics of clipping groups. You know, I haven't really done a good job of explaining exactly what a clipping group is and how it's going to function. Well, I started to say that it was another method of masking here inside Photoshop, but it works in a slightly different way. Luckily, it's very easy to work with. So here's the deal. Here's how it's going to work. We can take any image that we want, any photo that we have, maybe a family photo or a texture or, you know, really anything that you have. And what we're going to do is we're going to overlay it on top of our cookie cutter layer. So we're going to stick it on top of our black circle here. And the reason why I called my layer cookie cutter is because I imagine this overlaying photo that you and I are about to stick onto this circle as the dough. And then our actual layer here that you and I have created is going to be the cookie cutter. So in other words, it's going to hide away, or it's going to clip away anything that falls outside of our cookie cutter layer. So we're only going to see stuff inside the circle, if that makes sense. And by the way, on your cookie cutter layer, you can have whatever you want. I just did a simple circle here with you just to keep it easy, but we could have maybe a star shape or a pattern, or, you know, what would be really cool is some text. You know, when you see some text, maybe a company name or something, and then you see a photo inside the letters? That's exactly what we're talking about here. We could really pull that off in quite an easy way. So anyway, I'm anxious to show you how this is going to work. So I'm going to go and open up another file. I'm just going to hit Command O on my keyboard here, or Control O there, of course, on the PC side. And I'm going to go and grab an image here. You can, again, use any file that you want, any graphic that you have. I'm going to use resizing.jpg. This is a pretty big photograph. So I'll pop this guy open. Okay, there he is. And as always, what I'm going to do is I'll head up to my application bar and I'll choose Float All in Windows, something like this. And maybe you've kind of picked up on where I'm going with this. I essentially want to take this photo and drag them over on top of the black circle. Do you remember how to do this? We did this a while ago. I'm on my Move tool inside my toolbox. Go ahead and hit the V key on your keyboard to switch over to that tool. And all I'm going to do is click and drag my photo from his window into the black circle, something like this. Okay, perfect. And then as far as our resizing.jpg, we can close out of him. I'll go back to my application bar and then choose Consolidate All. All right. Now have a look at my layers panel. So we have the background layer, I have the cookie cutter layer, and then we have layer 1. Now you might want to rename that. I'll just call this, maybe I'll call this photo, or you could call it cookie dough or something like this. Now here's the moment of truth. What I want to do is I want to clip this photo to the cookie cutter layer. In other words, all I want to see is a circle with my photo inside it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my cursor over inside my layers palette. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and bring my cursor right between my two layers, and you should get this really weird, funky looking cursor. This guy here, try clicking. That's all there is to it. So what's happened here is the photo is now clipped to the contents of the cookie cutter layer. And again, the contents of that layer can be whatever you want. Now, I hope this worked for you. Here's the cool part. I'm going to go back to the photo layer, select him. I'm still on my Move tool. And now what I can do is I can move the image around inside my cookie cutter. So maybe I want to have something like this, you know, the road disappearing in the background or something like that. Or you know what I could even do is I could make use of my free transform. Command T or Control T. And I'll zoom out just a little bit and I'll scale this guy down. It's great when you start to get to a point in Photoshop where you're using a lot of different skills together. You're using your resizing and you're combining your images and you're using your masks and your clipping groups and all together to create some kind of a layout, right? Okay, very cool stuff. Now, what I'm going to do here is, of course, I could move and resize my photo, right, inside the cookie cutter. That's awesome. Or what I could do is I could grab the cookie cutter layer and I could move him around, right? So the two are independent, right? I can move each sort of independently of the other. I'm just going to undo that and go back to where I was. Or what I could do is I could hold down Control or Command and select both layers inside the layers palette and then move them both in unison if you want. The final thing that I want to show you, I'm going to select my cookie cutter layer, and what I can do on the cookie cutter layer is I can add or subtract pixels on this layer, which will show or hide more or less of my photo. So again, it's really all tied to the pixels on the cookie cutter layer. So, for example, I'm going to grab, let's see, I'm going to grab my paintbrush tool. I just hit the B key on my keyboard. Again, it doesn't matter what color I paint in, so long as I'm adding pixels to my layer, right? So I have my cookie cutter layer selected and I'm just painting in pixels. Or what I could do is I could switch over to my eraser tool over inside the toolbox, and I'll crank up the brush size here just by tapping my close square bracket key on my keyboard, and I'll start erasing away pixels on that layer. So there you go. That's kind of the basics anyway of clipping groups. They're a lot of fun and you can do some really cool things. Now, next up, I want to give you more of a practical application, a more practical example of where you might use this in your own work. All right, let me give you a practical example of where you might use your clipping groups. I mean, you're probably already thinking, hey, I could use this to help me create collages or neat photo effects and things like this. You're absolutely correct. This is just one idea that I'm going to bounce off you. I'm going to go and open up two files. So I'll double click on my gray background into the project files. And we have two files in here that I'm after. Texture 1 and Texture 2. Go ahead and grab those guys. And you know, by the way, I gave you an extra texture in there too if you want to experiment with that guy, Texture 3. But it's Texture 1 and 2 that I'm after. Go ahead and pop those guys open. And let's see here. The Texture 2 is just a photograph I took of a kind of a neat, gnarly looking concrete wall. I thought it was kind of neat looking, kind of a neat texture. So I took that photograph. And then Texture 1 is our good old-fashioned statue, this photo here again. But what I've done here with this photo is I took the liberty of getting rid of that background. Remember that drab sky? And essentially what I want to do is I want to overlay this texture, this concrete, on top of the statue. I want to make the statue look a little bit more old, a little bit perhaps kind of crumbling apart, this sort of thing. So here's what I'm going to do. As always, back to the application bar, and I'll go float all in Windows. I'm going to start off by dragging my texture into the statue. Just click and drag that guy over, something like this. And then as always, I'll get rid of this guy, and then I'll go back to the application bar and choose Consolidate All. Now, the trick, by the way, for really pulling this off is to have nice big images. So again, when I shoot something with my digital camera, at least in terms of pixels, I have a massive image to work with. Sometimes you drag an image over into another image and it's tiny, so you need some nice big images to work with. All I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up my clipping group to get started. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and bring my cursor between the two layers inside my layers palette. So obviously layer 1 is the texture and statue is the statue. And of course with Alt or Option held down, I'll click. And again, what that does is that maps the top layer to the bottom layer, to the pixels on the bottom layer. Okay, of course you can see my texture has now mapped to the contour of my statue, but I've lost a lot of the detail in the statue. We'll get to that in just a second. Before that, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the checkerboard pattern here. I'm finding that kind of distracting. So what I'm going to do is over inside the layers palette, I'm going to go and create a brand new blank layer, and I'll drag this guy below the statue. And I'll simply fill him with white. So if you want here, hit the D key on your keyboard and then hold down Control or Command here on the Mac and hit Delete just to fill that layer with white. And you might want to rename him. I'll call this white background, something like that if you want. Okay, now back to our clipping group, back to our statue. I'm going to go back to layer 1. We should probably rename this guy as well. I'll just call this Texture. Perfect. And what I want to do is I want to try and fade back this texture a little bit. It's a little too heavy. It's a little too harsh, obviously, because it's just sort of showing us the normal default texture. Well, don't forget, what I can do is I have my opacity slider, so I can actually reduce down the opacity of my texture. But as I do so, I really start to lose a lot of the texture if I drop the opacity too far. So that's really no good. I'll crank my opacity back up. Instead, I think what I'll do is I'll apply a blending mode. Remember our blending modes. So I'll drop down my blending modes, and this is where we get to start experimenting and playing. And this is where the real, sort of the fun of Photoshop comes in. And I go, all right, what's going to look good? I have a feeling that overlay is going to give us a decent result. I choose overlay, my opacity is at 100%, and look at my statue. It looks awesome. I'll just zoom in a little bit. Look at that. It looks almost like there's sort of moss growing on it, and really kind of decrepit and decaying. Pretty cool. All right. So you could, of course, grab your opacity and drop it down just a little bit if you want to reduce that effect. Again, this is where the real fun of Photoshop comes in, is the experimenting and the playing and the fiddling around. Maybe I could try a different blending mode, perhaps hard light, or maybe difference is going to give me something pretty crazy, something like that, or perhaps maybe up into darker color. You can really have fun with this and play around until you get something that really looks cool. But I'm really quite partial to my overlay, and perhaps I'll drop my opacity down just a little bit, maybe down into the 70s, somewhere in here. I think that looks fantastic. So there you go. That's sort of a practical example of where you might use clipping groups. And again, it's always fun to throw in other options there. I could use my free transform if I wanted to transform the texture, move them around. I've got my blending modes, and I've got my opacity as well. And if I really wanted to, I could throw in some layer styles and some other effects as well.